Our final speaker this afternoon is Mona Mehta. Mona Mehta is a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Her dissertation examines how a multitude of political institutions and civic spaces of liberal democracy have become implicated in the production of a popular consensus in favor of exclusion and communal violence in Gujarat, India. With grant support from the National Science Foundation, she has conducted 18 months of intensive field work in Gujarat, and she has taught courses in social science theory and South Asian identity politics at the University of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Mona Mehta.
Thank you, thank you. Can you all see me? Okay. All right, so finally we're here to talk about the two countries that everyone has at the tip of their tongue when they talk about globalization, India and China. Okay, is this better? Okay. So yeah, India and China. Some analysts have actually termed this, this phenomenon of the growth stories of India and China as termed this concept called Chindia, which is a combination of China and India. And part of it, actually, that term is catchy and savvy, but it also conceals, I think, to a great extent, how different these stories of India and China are. So I want to talk today, the talk is titled Yogi and the Mandarin, A Tale of Two Asian Revolutions. Now, I think the word revolution is important because revolution means something that is epoch-making, something that is potentially transformational, something that is about to bring in a new kind of order. And what I want to talk about today is these two such spectacular revolutions that India and China represent and embody. And they're both admirable, yet very different. And they have, each of them have their own problems. So the point here is not to kind of valorize simply these two success stories, but trying to understand how they became possible. Now, I'm a political scientist who does qualitative work, so I'm not an economist. The talk here, as you will see, is actually going to be a kind of political, sociological perspective of the story of India and China. So I'm not so much into graphs and charts. I have a few charts, but I think that I'm more interested in telling these stories from a particular framework. And I think, and all along, I mean, along the line, we'll also talk about, you know, the facts and the hard kind of data that goes into making what is happening in India and China today. So, so this is just a quote from a business magazine, which says, India and China rarely has the economic ascent of two still relatively poor nations been watched with such a mixture of awe, opportunism, and trepidation. They possess the weight and dynamism to transform the 21st century global economy. Now, this kind of, you know, captures the whole the whole aspect of revolution and why should we care about India and China and what's going on in these two places. Now, I want to propose to you a particular framework of the Yogi and the Mandarin as a kind of heuristic device of looking at two particular models and approaches that India and China represent. Yogi being kind of simplistically and heuristically speaking, India and China representing Mandarin. And I want to stress that these two categories need not and should not be taken literally. So it's a heuristic device, it's a particular paradigm of trying to understand these two stories and understanding what's so different about what seemingly seems like this common forward leap in these, that these two countries are experiencing economically. So, so let's talk a little bit about the Yogi. What does the Yogi or the figure of the Yogi connote to most of you? What are the if we had to list a set of traits of a yogi, what would they be? Peaceful, serenity, sage, knowledgeable, mindful, okay. Let's see what we have. Intuitive, non-linear, holistic, and introspective. So these are just, in some ways, some of the things that are going on in the Indian model and the Indian story are, have layers of some of these categories and these traits that we see in this idea of a yogi. Now, again, these are not watertight distinctions. This does not mean that some of these traits one cannot apply to what is going on in the Chinese model. But this is just a one kind of way of looking at the story of India. What does Mandarin connote to you? Tradition? Power? Hierarchical? Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see. Efficiency. So Mandarin actually comes from, of course, it means a bureaucrat in the imperialist Chinese state. And the root word of Mandarin actually comes from a Sanskrit word called mantri. So you see some of these overlapping commonalities. So efficiency, order, because what does a bureaucrat do, right? Efficiency, order, goal-oriented, and a creature of hierarchy, right? And in many ways, I think what we're going to see, without trying to make these into kind of absolute cliches, the story of India and China, in some ways, are inflected with some of these traits that we see in the yogi and the Mandarin. So, okay, let's moving forward. Where are China and India on the map? China is about twice the size of India. They, of course, China is the fourth largest and the most populous country in the world, with a population of 1.3 billion. And India is the seventh largest and the second most populous country in the world, with also a population of more than 1 billion. Now, China and India, of course, share a border. They're politically, in the contemporary moment, they're not the best of friends. I mean, in 1965, they fought a war. They have ongoing political dispute on the border, on the Chinese-Indian border. And of course, then there is the whole contentious issue of Tibet, right? That China refuses to recognize Tibet, and because of which the Tibetan government in exile, led by the Dalai Lama, actually is currently in India for the past several decades in northern India, in a place called Dharamsala. So, so this is kind of the contemporary political situation of these two countries. They're sharing borders and not very friendly as neighbors. Now, historically, they, of course, share roots that go back well beyond the contemporary globalizing moment of globalization. You see that the Silk routes, they were connected through the Silk routes, which were a series of trade and cultural transmission routes that connected the East and the West. And so the links between China and India, and of China and India to the rest of the world, are not new. They're not a factor of the contemporary moment alone, that they go back in history. And actually, some people would say that that the emergence or the re-emergence of China and India today is not something new, but it is, in fact, a kind of reclaiming of a past economic dominance and glory, because historically, at the time of these trading patterns, the two countries were extremely prosperous and globally economically dominant in the products that they traded in. So you had, I mean, silk and jewels and spices. So, so you see that there is a longer history of the ties between the two countries. And of course, we know that more recently, only 50 years ago, India and China were among the poorest and economically most isolated countries in the world. And so I think part of the awe of the whole story of India and China is that how did India and China emerge as these economic giants as they have, given that just a few decades ago, they really were so, economically in a troubled position. And they continue to be so. I think we should never forget that even with all this, the chatter about globalization and the success story of India and China, that vast portions of their populations continue to remain excluded from the benefits of globalization in both countries. So when we think about India and China today, what is it in the kind of most cliched sense that comes to your mind? When you think of India and China, what are some of the things that come to your mind in the context of the global economy today? Food? Technology? Call centers? Exactly. So when your Dell laptop or some technical tool breaks down and you call up someone and the other person on the other side of the phone says, hi, my name is Mike, how can I help you? Well, Mike might actually be Mohan sitting in Mumbai. And many times actually when that has happened to me and they hear my Indian accent, all of a sudden the American accent drops and, we're talking in this mutual, in this familiar accent. So yeah, everyone I think today, when we think of India, we do think of call centers and engineers. And yeah, what about China? Goods, factories. So the kind of omnipresent made in China label, right? It's everywhere, it's on everything. Yes? Oh, sorry. Okay. So low-priced consumer goods and call centers are some of the kind of very, very broad, cliched ideas of, or emblems of what these two economies are becoming famous for today. And because of this kind of celebration of India and China and their success story in the contemporary moment, I think it's very easy to forget how different their stories are. And I think part of the whole heuristic device of thinking about the Yogi and the Mandarin as two different models is also to tell you the story of how India and China have come to this or are on this path that seems very similar, but it's a story of very different ends and very different means. And I think that, so as we go along, I just urge you to kind of keep those two broad categories in mind and think of the extent to which they apply to the ways in which the two experiments really in these two countries are unfolding. They seem very similar, they seem very kind of, unidirectional, but actually they are quite different. So, some of this will be very elementary for you, and I'm sure that, you teach some of this in your classrooms, but this is one way to introduce this topic to high school students, which is, so yeah, when does modern China appear on the scene, in the China that we understand today, the People's Republic of China? In 1949, of course, it's established as a result of an armed conflict, which is quite violent, between Chinese nationals and imperialist powers, and the communists eventually win under the leadership of Mao, and then we have the birth of what we understand as the People's Republic of China. So politically, the system that is instituted is a one-party rule. The Communist Party becomes the sole political force in the country. There's no private property. Collectivized farming is instituted. State owns 77% of the economy, and collectives own everything else. So this is an attempt then to implement a particular Marxist, particular communist agenda of nation building and economy building. As a result of this project, you see a whole host of religious and cultural practices that are suppressed ethnic minorities. I mean, we don't realize, or sometimes we forget, I think, that how ethnically diverse China is as well. You know, but what the revolution did was in part kind of denied or, you know, shunned the cultural, historical, religious practices of Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism. I mean, Buddhism, which emerged in India, actually flourished in China for many years. And so part of this political project is, of course, the suppression of these cultural and religious articulations. And of course, between 1959 and 1962, you have a combination of bad weather conditions and certain economic policies of collective farming and taxation that lead to the starvation death of almost 40 million people. And of course, this is quite astounding. And in 1966, Mao introduces the Cultural Revolution that is basically involved in purging political rivals, and that too turns out to be a very violent process and leading to the death of 10 million people. So this is the kind of political context in which the idea of modern China, the project of modern China is taking place. As we will see later on, this is a very different political context compared to India's birth in 1947. Very different conditions. Perhaps, I mean, of course, these are, you know, the project of nation building is taking place in both countries. There is a vision of emancipating the vast majority of the masses who are poor, predominantly peasants in both countries. But you have a very different leadership, a very different vision, and a very different means of achieving this vision. And again, I want to kind of go back to this whole Mandarin Yogi model and to talk about that very different set of processes that are going on in the two countries. So when does China enter the global economy? After Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping takes over. Chinese economy is liberalized in 1979, and the reforms or liberalization, as it is called, starts in 1979 with a process of decollectivizing these collective farmlands, instituting special economic zones, and agricultural reforms. And a huge part of China's project of liberalizing the economy is instituting and setting up an immense infrastructure, right? So China's most visible infrastructure project, after it begins to liberalize, begins to eventually interact with the rest of the world in terms of trade, is setting up highways and roads. So, I mean, you can see these astounding figures. In '89, you had only 168 miles of expressways, and in 2004, you have 21,000 almost. And then by 2020, if this pace continues, you have 55,000 miles of expressways, which is the total length of the entire American highway system. So, so you see the kind of rapid infrastructural development that is undertaken under this new policy, and of course, all of this infrastructure building is going to require a lot of energy. So what does China do? Builds new coal mines, new electricity grids, uses natural oil, gas, and all these resources in order to institute this massive project. These are just some basic fact sheets of the Chinese economic story. You see here a GDP of 11.6% in 2006. Consistently, there is a kind of almost double digit, except 2008, which of course has been affected by the recession. So you see a little dip there, and you see the PPP figures, and you see the composition. I mean, you have 10% agriculture, you have 49% industry, and then you have 40% services. So almost 50% of Chinese economy is dedicated to manufacturing and goods through industries. Now, this is a huge shift from just 20 years ago, right? And just take a look at Beijing Skyline as a result of this massive project of economic growth. You have these, I mean, everyone recognizes this, the Beijing Olympic Stadium, this very kind of resembling a very, very state-of-the-art kind of fancy nest-shaped stadium, and then you have these really marvelous tall buildings and a fantastic skyline that could actually well be somewhere in Western Europe, right? And for a country that was predominantly poor, predominantly peasants just 20, 30 years ago, to have achieved to come to this stage, really, I think is quite astounding. You cannot implement this kind of a project without the traits that we saw in the Mandarin, right? A particular kind of dedication to set a set of plans, to efficiency, and all of that went into what you're seeing most kind of materially in the manifestation of the skyline in Beijing. But I think these glittering images are also, I think they reveal as much as they conceal, right? So what they tell you, of course, is the economic, the growth that has gone into China in all these years. But they also conceal to you at some level the political system and the environment under which this has been realized. So. And we're going to get to this in some time. This would not and cannot really be possible in India in the same way. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But China's political system with a single-party rule has a very clean and clear kind of chain of command. There's really no possibility of dissent. And all these factors politically make it possible to really set an agenda and go whole hog and implement it in a way that a country like India simply cannot do, just because it has to. It's much more messy in India, right? I mean, every 5 years, if you have everything that you do, if you have to face an election, I mean, there are limitations to what you can do and what you cannot do, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So again, I just want to go back to what is going on in China and in the Mandarin model and how some of it you see here playing out. And of course, the infrastructure, but also China's famous or infamous OneChild Policy, right? That is a poster from a 1980s government advertisement. And the whole project of accelerating economic growth required the suppression of population. How are you going to, how are you going to grow at a particular, figure which you have set out for yourself as your goal, as your agenda, if you have to feed millions of people, right? So what you do is you basically institute a policy that constrains people's ability to have children, basically, and reduce the population. So the one-child policy is very strictly implemented. You have urban families can have one child. In the rural areas, you can have more than one child if your first child is a girl. And of course, under this policy, the government conducted 10 million forced abortions and 10 million forced sterilizations in the past 20-odd years. And as a result, 40 million births were averted. And how do you think this was implemented? This was implemented with the help of a very dedicated cadre of Communist Party workers, right from the kind of really rural, small-town villages to the urban areas. And here again, you see the efficiency of a bureaucrat, of a Mandarin. In order to realize a policy like this. And of course, in India, you have sections of the Indian middle class who marvel at China's one-child policy and hope and wish that something like that would be introduced in India as well. Whether that is going to be possible or no, I mean, I think is an open question. But there is a section of Indian society that looks to China and with envy and awe, of course, for what they are able to do as a political system, which is simply not possible in a country like India. So, okay, now we come to the story of India. India gains independence in 1947 under this man, M.K. Gandhi. He leads the Indian freedom struggle with the ideals of civil disobedience and nonviolence, which become the hallmarks of India's freedom struggle. Not that there were not violent elements within the freedom movement, but I think Gandhi was very successful in steering some of those forces and really convincing a vast majority of Indians to really adopt nonviolence and civil disobedience as the way to protest and challenge colonial rule. And I mean, this is not something that textbooks will say, but India's cultural revolution. But in this whole mode of comparing the story of India with China, where you saw in China, in the cultural revolution in China, what it entailed, the kind of violence that it entailed, you see in the India story that the moment of the birth of the Indian nation is actually very vocally about peace and nonviolence. And some of those ideas get instituted in the freedom struggle as well. And part of the agenda of the freedom struggle is not just to get freedom from imperial rule, but also to work towards the emancipation of women, lower castes, and through democratic empowerment. I mean, remember, India is a deeply, deeply unequal society. I mean, you have a centuries-old caste system. You have half the population, which is women, who have historically been marginalized. And Gandhi seizes this moment of independence to really bring in these emancipatory agendas onto the table of nation building. And, at a time when India is thinking about what kind of a nation do we want to be? What kind of a political system do we want to choose? And a lot of those ideas get reflected in the constitution that India adopts. So officially, India defines itself as a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic, and it was officially constituted as a republic in 1950. It gained independence in 47. For 3 years, there was a constituent assembly that debated every draft and every article of the Indian constitution, eventually writing one of the longest written constitutions in the world. And some of you might know that the person who presided over the writing of this constitution was a former untouchable, Baba Sahib Ambedkar, who was a great political scientist, got his degree from Columbia in New York, and he had serious differences with Gandhi, by the way. But I think he very much eventually came on board and drafted the Indian Constitution. So the Constitution guarantees fundamental rights and a rule of law. Does that mean that fundamental rights and a rule of law is all hunky-dory in India? Absolutely not. I mean, that's not the agenda of my talk. I'm trying to tell you the ideas that shaped the political systems of the two countries, because I want to then think about the economic stories by looking at the politics and the political conditions of possibility of certain economic visions and the limitations of certain others. So each of them obviously have their own limitations, as we will see. But so officially, India adopts a liberal democratic constitution, a multi-party democracy with the prime minister as an elected head of the government. And then you have special laws for the protection of ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities. Like China, India is an extremely diverse society. You have more than 2,000 ethnic groups. You have 19 official languages. I mean, just to give you a sense, the current Prime Minister of India is a Sikh man. The president is a woman, and the vice president is a Muslim. And the leader of India's ruling party is an Italian-born Roman Catholic. It just kind of gives you a snapshot of the kind of diversity that existed. And I think here again, going back to kind of the Yogi model, and while China's story is about disrupting kind of a certain past, at least officially, you see that Gandhi, through the freedom struggle, kind of protected and celebrated some of the diversity that was inherent in this society, but also brought in an agenda of change and emancipation that was to ameliorate the problems that plagued Indian society and continue to plague India in terms of inequality. So you see, this is the political vision, and then economically, what does India choose to be? It chooses a kind of mixed economy model. It's inspired by a socialist vision, and for the longest time, till India chooses to become, enter the global economy and liberalizes economically, it just grew at a rate of 3.5, which was sarcastically called the Hindu rate of growth, right? So you had this very, very low, sustained, but very low 3.5% economic growth. But you also had land reforms. So to redistribute land in a society that for centuries had been really extremely feudal. So you had these landlords owning huge swaths of land, and peasants working on these farms for a pittance, and the Constitution instituted land reforms and redistributed some of this land, similar in some ways to the project in China also, right? I mean, you have even there a project of emancipating the peasants, right? But it's done very differently here, as you can see. I mean, economically, this era came to be known as the license Raj, because it was plagued by immense bureaucratic red tape and corruption, and you needed all kinds of licenses and regulations that you had to face and overcome in order to set up any small business or factory in India. And so all these policies, so India borrows this five-year plan model from Russia, actually, and institutes these economic plans through this 5-year economic plan. And but I think here that the thing to note, though, is the difference, again, and the divergence in the story of India, in that all of this is happening within a democratic framework where the politics and the elected officials have to systematically face elections every 5 years. And I think that is the fundamental difference in the kind of the early years pre-liberalization that you see in India, which was different from the way the Chinese political system was set up at that time. And so one comes now to the era of liberalization, which is celebrated by a lot of people as the kind of watershed moment in Indian contemporary history. That finally, but there is a context to these economic reforms. This is a time when India's growth rate has plummeted below the Hindu rate of growth, so it's even less than 3.5. There's high inflation. India is almost about to default on debts that it has taken from the IMF and international lending agencies. And there's high inflation. So all of these really, India is at the brink of a financial crisis, basically. And in this desperate moment, Manmohan Singh, who is the current prime minister and who was then the finance minister of India, actually steps in, and who is now known as the architect of economic reforms, institutes reforms in India. So what does liberalization of the economy involve? Very simply and basically, it involves reducing government regulation of and investment in the economy, encouraging private business, encouraging exports, encouraging imports, and basically creating conditions where you encourage trade. And of course, sure enough, this started to prove fruitful in terms of economic growth. India starts then to climb up the ladder of growth, and you see these recent figures. In 2006, it was almost equal to what China was roughly around that time. 2008, of course, again, those are the figures of recession creeping in. But basically, you see, this from 3.5% for the first 40 years of independent India, you see in almost 2 decades, this near 2 double-digit growth rate. So, I mean, there's a reason why people are so enamored by what's going on in India and China, because the whole change is so dramatic, in some ways. And so the GDP, if you look at just the breakup of the sectors, 17.2% is agriculture, industry is 29%, and services is 53%. Now, although agriculture contributes to only 17% of the economy, the vast majority of Indians are actually employed in the agricultural sector. So they are the largest employer in the Indian economy. So that's something to keep in mind. And so I have a table that maybe might be useful for kind of going over some of the things that were just said. I don't know, this might be useful in your classroom, but it just in some ways repeats some of the things that were just mentioned. The political system, you see a speed of growth. In 91, it starts in India. In 78, you start the liberalization process in China. And you see the average growth rates in the past 2 decades in both countries. And areas of specialization, again, India is predominantly in software design services and precision industries, and China in mass manufacturing, electronics, and heavy industrial plants. So now, I mean, so all of this is good. It's all, India and China are growing, and you have this high GDP. But none of this is without its problems, right? You have the Gini index, which is the index which tells you the rate of inequality. And you see in India, it's 36%. In China, it's 47%. And anything above 40 is actually considered dangerous by economists. But, I mean, and this is something that we've heard about in other presentations, how the income disparities within the countries have actually increased. I mean, by now, I think it's not at all news that globalization is not inherently an egalitarian process. It's far from it. I mean, on the one hand, globalization has all the potential of creating growth, but it has no way of guaranteeing that this growth is going to actually be distributed in an equal manner. And that's where I think the political system and the political vision comes in. And I think both India and China are seriously lacking in ensuring that the process is egalitarian. So you have high rates of inequality, you have FDI, and yeah, these are some facts that might be useful for you to see some of the future areas of growth. You have R&D. China wants to diversify in business. I mean, very broadly, so where does India lag behind? India lags behind in terms of infrastructure. It does not have the infrastructure that China has able to build in the past 2 decades. On the other hand, China has a weak banking and legal system. In those areas, India has a very solid banking system and a judicial system. I mean, that doesn't mean that the Indian courts are not defaulting and that they are not overworked and all of that, but it does have a very robust legal system. And of course, the British left behind the English language, right? So so India has, I think, made full use of the ability to access that language and through it access the global economy. And of course, what holds India back again is bureaucratic red tape, corruption. So here again, I want to kind of point out that this whole Yogi Mandarin business is good at one level, but why it's not a kind of watertight thing. I mean, you have the Mandarins in India really kind of, excessively intervening in a way in the democratic process that is not really helping democracy, right? So you have excessive red tape, you have corruption in the Indian bureaucracy, which is also, the Indian bureaucracy is also very extensive. I mean, this is, they inherited this system from the British, and so it's a very, very, I think the Indian state continues to be the largest employer of people, even today. And this, we can debate this, but, Peter Drucker made an observation, which is that India has managed rural to urban transition in a relatively smooth and peaceful manner, which China is still struggling to do. Maybe. We've seen Slumdog Millionaire, everyone. We know about the problem of urbanization. We know about slums. We know about the urban-rural divide, actually, that I'm going to talk about in actually just a minute in terms of the costs. But I'll come back to how that transition has taken place in India in terms of this influx of population from the rural areas to urban areas, and how has this migrant population been dealt with in India and China through an example that I will talk about a little later. But so basically, I think 50 million Chinese people have been lifted out of poverty in one generation. This is by no stretch of imagination a mean task, right? I mean, this is absolutely stunning. But it has also come at a cost, right? There is suppression of dissent. I mean, we all know about the Tiananmen Square massacre, where student demonstrators were killed by the army. There is no freedom of expression in any concrete way. Just, I think last week, the New York Times had an article about how computers that are made in the US, which are sent to China, have to compulsorily install this internet censorship software. Because China doesn't allow its citizens to access the internet without censoring. So if you type in Tiananmen Square in Google in China, it will not come up. The same page that will come up to you here or in other parts of the world will not come up in China. So the media is very much state-controlled. I mean, in India, as with the liberalization also happened, the liberalization of the media. All of a sudden, you had this very boring. For all these years, you had this very boring state channel, which spoke this very, very kind of very classical Hindi, and this particular kind of English, which was not accessible to most people, very highly Sanskritized Hindi with the news readers of the state channel in India. And all of a sudden, in the early 90s, you have all these private channels. You have MTV, and you have Star TV, and you have all these things. I'm not saying this is necessarily a good or bad thing, but what it has done is that today you have a whole plethora of local Indian news TV channels and stations, right? And you had a very, very rigorous debate, criticism in the media, because the media could literally go anywhere. I mean, to the extent that when the attacks happened in Mumbai in last year in November, when the Taj Mahal Hotel was attacked, you had all these Indian TV channels covering every second of these attacks. And the army later on criticized the media for excessively covering the attacks and the hotels where the hostages were trapped for all these days, because they said that they gave away important secrets because they were covering everything, But so you have a very different situation in India, and of course, freedom of religion. China has about more than 20 million Muslims. Okay, you have the Uyghurs, you have the Hui, you have the whole issue of Tibet. You have Falun Gong as a sect which is not recognized by the Chinese state. So all this economic progress has come at a cost in China, and I think. India also, I want to say, has experimented with the Mandarin model. And even though it is not, whether you look at it as an experimentation with Mandarin Model, by no stretch of imagination has India's record of human rights been flawless and spotless, right? I mean, minorities in India are also marginalized, are also penalized, but on the whole, officially, it becomes very difficult for the state to actually do this, to officially get away with that kind of persecution that is possible in a place with an authoritarian regime. I just want to tell you about this event that many of you may or may not have heard. But in the village of Nandigram, this happened in 2007, a chemical plant was going to be set up in this village. And the government, the state of West Bengal, by the way, continues to have locally, the longest running single-party communist. It's not a single party, it's a coalition of communist parties. The government in West Bengal is led by the Communist Party. And so I suppose in a kind of China-esque way, the Communist Party is now trying to get investment, get industries into the state. And it seized this land, 10,000 acres of land from farmers for a chemical plant. And the farmers protested because they weren't happy with the compensation, and that this was actually arable, cultivable land. And so what the army did, the local state government there, along with the cadres of the Communist Party and the army, actually attacked these villages who were protesting the coming of this plant, and as a result killed 14 people and wounded 70 more. Now, the Indian media and civil society was absolutely up in arms. And there was all this controversy, there was all this debate and protest. It was a very humiliating experience for the Communist Party. I mean, and within, for 24 hours, they tried to block this village from any journalists and anyone to enter, but they couldn't sustain it for long. I mean, and eventually the Communist Party was defeated in the next election in West Bengal. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the Mandarin model, when applied in a place like India, when you try to grab land and you try to force feed a certain economic project, it's simply not going to work because the democratic system will not allow it to work beyond a point. And that's what I meant when I said that that the spectacular skyline of Beijing is not going to be possible in this kind of overnight way in any city in India. It's just not going to be possible because the political system is very different. I just want to quickly go over the rural-urban divide. You have extreme income disparity in China and India, and I think a lot of people have talked about this over the last 2 days. I don't want to overemphasize it. Globalization has not ensured equality, obviously. And so you have in China, how do you get land for all these special economic zones and these industrial plants and factories, right? You get them from peasants. And whether they like or don't like the compensation you're willing to pay for the land that you're taking, the peasants really, beyond a point, have no recourse to challenge that because the Chinese state is all-powerful. And so tens of millions of farmers in China have become landless as a result of this economic project and boom. And that doesn't mean that protests don't happen in China. I mean, in 2005, you have 87,000 local protests. But where do these protests go? What kind of a political outcome do they bring about? I mean, do they bring about any sort of justice? No, there are limitations in this model because a one-party authoritarian state is not built to be receptive to a population that it does not have to face and seek votes from. Right? In a way that, but that doesn't mean that rural division and, rural-urban divide is not bad in India. I mean, I think India has, in some ways, more to answer for because when you have a democracy that is explicitly about ensuring equality and inclusion, and you continue to have you have this kind of inequalities, then that there is a serious flaw in the democratic system. However, I think there has been a reduction, as you can see, in the poverty line, almost 50% decrease in the past little more than a decade. And then you come to the issue of rule of law. What is rule of law? Yes?
You have expectations about the government's kicking in to protect their rights from other people, do business without having doing corruption, etc.
Seek redress through a court system. And yeah, absolutely. And basically the fact that there is one law that applies to everyone, that no one is above the law, right? The Chinese model, the Mandarin model, is not so comfortable with the rule of law. I mean, basically, the poor have little chance of redress in the Chinese system. So, for example, I'm sure that you read a lot about this during the Beijing Olympics last year. I mean, Beijing was being spruced up like nobody's business, right? I mean, it had to be made into this glittering destination for the World Olympics. And boy, was it glittering, yes. But how did it happen, right? I mean, you had these vast majorities of old shanty towns that were either people were just pushed out of their slums. You know, these very old houses were basically demolished, and the slums that could not be demolished, which were farther away, were actually covered up with these huge walls. And so people lost land, and they lost land, but they didn't really get a compensation for it. So you have a system which is not receptive, which is why rule of law is really one of the biggest drawbacks of China. I mean, that does not mean that corruption does not exist in India, but I just want to give you a story about how rule of law operates at the local level in China, I mean, in India. There is a fancy neighborhood in the city of Mumbai where Bollywood stars live. This is a very kind of upscale neighborhood. And the residents of this neighborhood wanted to build a jogger's park. Now, smack in the middle of a jogger's park on the track was a shanty dweller who lived there for the past 2-3 decades. I think he was there for 20 years or so. And he was the one thing that came in between of these affluent residents' enjoyment of a fancy jogger's park. And he was like an eyesore, right? These are very influential citizens of Mumbai. But what does the shanty owner do? He goes to court and gets a stay order. He sits there for 5 years, refusing to leave that spot because he had the protection of the court and a stay order from the court that nobody, no amount of Bollywood connections or political connections was able to undermine. I mean, and eventually he left because he got compensation and he was happy with it. And then, I mean, they built their joggers track. But, I mean, this is just a small story. I mean, to evict a small shanty in an affluent neighborhood in Bombay is not a given. That there is an access to the courts, that the poor can get the courts to intervene and delay the process, which is why these fancy skyscrapers cannot just all of a sudden emerge on the skyline of Bombay, because most of Bombay is slums. Right? I mean, and you know that from the images that you've seen in Slumdog Millionaire. So you have very different political systems, and it's important to understand sometimes the pace of India and China is integrally linked to the political systems within which these economies these models are being implemented. And so then comes the million-dollar question of democracy and economic growth. Does economic prosperity lead to democracy? I mean, this is a question to think about. I mean, do you have any responses to this? Does prosperity eventually lead to democracy? Yes? Yes? Oh, I think she gave the example of Saudi Arabia. And basically that the theory that economic prosperity leads to democracy is certainly not worked in Saudi Arabia, so no. Yes? That's interesting. Yeah. There's a lot of rich people in India who feel their vote doesn't count because the slum dwellers have more voting power than them. And so they're going to be like, Indian democracy doesn't work. Well, it doesn't work for them, maybe. But it does work for the slum dwellers. I mean, I'm not saying that it's improved the conditions of the slum dwellers. But what I'm saying is they have the numbers and they know it. It's not easy to take away this political system that is the only means through which they can bring about any sort of political emancipation for themselves. And so all of this talk that a lot of times the Indian middle class, once you get prosperous and you get all smug and all of that, you sometimes take for granted your set of political rights. The slum dwellers in India don't ever do that, I don't think. So, I mean, in political science debates and theories, there's no evidence to suggest that prosperity leads to democracy or vice versa. I mean, Singapore is an example. China right now is an example. Saudi Arabia is an example. But the US is an example. Okay, we can definitely debate that controversial statement. But yes, I mean, why not? Now, at the same time, democracy is not going to ensure equality. Democracy is not going to, on its own, ensure economic growth. I mean, but it does provide, I think, what India shows is certain checks on the excesses of state power that are not possible, which also become the reason for slowing down this breakneck speed of economic growth that everyone seems to want in this era of globalization. Now, Amartya Sen, you might have heard, a Nobel-winning economist. I think Professor Brady mentioned him on Monday as well. He has a theory. And the theory goes that no famine has ever taken place in the history of the world in a functioning democracy. So basically, famines cannot take place in a functioning democracy. And his research shows that simply because democracies have to eventually go back and seek votes, they cannot get away with that level of callousness that famines, when they are, and oftentimes famines are man-made, right? I mean, they are definitely influenced and triggered by natural conditions, but oftentimes famines, when they take place at that large scale, a lot of times that is about bureaucratic failure, about political failure, right, to distribute and give people access to food. And so Amartya Sen's theory about that democracy, he seems to think, and the book to read for that particular, I mean, he's also an economist who tells us to think about poverty in a holistic way, okay? So he's the one who devised this idea of the Human Development Index for the UN, right? It's an index in which poverty is not to be measured just by the amount of food you eat or how much money you earn. That poverty is a kind of all-encompassing thing which includes a set of rights, your ability to enjoy certain rights, and your ability to realize your full potential as human beings. He's a very interesting economist, and his idea of Human Development Index is a very sophisticated idea over this kind of very narrow World Bank approach of poverty index, which is about how much money you earn or how much food or calories you can intake. Okay, so finally, I just want to wrap up. I started with this kind of, the two metaphors of the Yogi and the Mandarin, told you to think about this framework of China and India through these two categories. And I told you to not take it literally, but to use it as a way to think about these two stories. And I want to end with another set of metaphors. And they're about elections and Olympics, right? So he saw, I mean, I think I have way too many examples of the Olympics because, that's just something that kind of epitomizes China's recent economic prowess, right? What people saw in, $44 billion was spent for the Olympics. You had these fantastic stadiums and theaters and roads and metros and all of that. And it was a very spectacular achievement. I mean, no one can take away from China the pride that it, at one level, can rightfully be theirs for achieving a kind of infrastructural prowess that a lot of Western European countries would have or would want, right? But at the same time, I want to talk about another, and of course we know about the problems that the Olympics entail, and I don't want to repeat that. But another spectacle was going on in India, which was maybe the Olympics of democracy or the Olympics of elections just last month, right? I mean, India is the world's largest democracy. Despite all its serious faults, no serious scholar is going to challenge the fact that India is a democracy or no. So you had 714 million eligible voters. You had 828,000 polling centers. One of them was even set up in a lion sanctuary for one voter. Okay. And then you had 1,055 political parties. Okay. And you had 6.1 million civil and police officials on duty to ensure that these elections were carried out across the length and breadth of India in 3 separate phases. Because it's a huge country, very populated. It was actually, this is the summertime in India. Last year it was extremely hard conditions. And then you had voting machines. The second time electronic voting machines were used, which were lugged across the length and breadth of the country on trucks, trains, cattle, donkeys, and so that they could be reached to the most remote polling stations in India. And then there were 131 seats reserved for backward castes and tribal groups in these elections. So these are two very different kinds of spectacles, 2 different kinds of achievements of these 2 countries. And basically, I just want to leave you with this thought that, as the 21st century unfolds, will the Yogi and the Mandarin learn the positive qualities of each other, right? I mean, India has serious drawbacks in terms of its infrastructure and needs to learn a lot from what China has achieved. China, too, can learn a lot by making this process of economic growth and prosperity more inclusive, more representative. And I just have a set of questions that you will get this, so you need not write it down, that you can, for the classroom, that you can raise. And yep, that's the end. Thank you. Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I can take 1 or 2 questions. Yes?
So, economic powerhouse, which do you predict is going to be the one that leaps forward? Which do you think is going to be the one that becomes the dominant power?
Right. One more. Repeat the question. So the question is that between India and China, who's going to win? Who's going to make it? My question to that question is, what is winning? And also, I think this is an ends and means kind of thing, right? I mean, the point is not really. It's good to have prosperity because it makes people better off, enables them to lead better lives. But prosperity, just in terms of economic growth, is a very limited view of things. And so I think it's the process of how you achieve those goals rather than just the goals. And I'm not underestimating the goals here, is important. So I think as I said, the jury is still out. I don't know who's going to win because I don't know what winning means in this context, you know. But I do hope that both countries, I think they are going to be forces to be reckoned with economically and also increasingly because of economics politically. And also they're a third of humanity, you know. Just in terms of the sheer size of human beings involved in the project of Chindia, I mean, you're talking about a huge mass of people. And so I think for all these reasons, and also I think that one doesn't know where it's going to end, but they need to learn from each other. This is what I'm going to say. Take the best of both. Does someone have anything else? Yes?
My understanding is a lot of industry in China already can't operate at full steam because they're running out of water. India is desperate for water. To what extent can they propel forward? So far, we don't have a way of magically creating water. And you've got huge population growth expected in both countries.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see this machine being able to continue indefinitely. You know, they're saying now by next year, half of India's population will live on 5 gallons of water a day per person. You can't run a good economy with those limited resources.
Yeah. I don't know the hard facts about water, but I mean you're absolutely right that there are serious scarcity issues, and I think that India will have to devise creative ways. I mean, dams, right, are one solution, right? Building dams. I mean, whether building big dams is ecologically viable, whether that itself will entail displacement of thousands of people, right? I mean, there are all kinds of ethical concerns and political concerns that are not separate from this economic agenda. So, I mean, I think there has to be a creative solution, not necessarily an economically efficient one, you know, because I think economic efficiency alone actually only makes us worse off. I think we have to think of this in a more holistic way.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.